This video will be looking at the mammalian circulation, and in particular we're going to focus on two aspects of this. So the first thing we're going to look at is the structure and the function of arteries, veins and capillaries, and the second thing that we're going to look at is blood flow through the heart. And in particular, we're going to pay attention to how the digestive system links into this. Remembering all along that for this external examination for NCA, while you do need to know the basics of the circulatory system as well as respiration, which we'll look at a little bit later, the focus is always on the digestive system, so mammals as consumers. So that's our focus. How does the circulation of the mammal play a role in how the mammal consumes and processes food? Before we look at the basically the blood flow through the heart, I wanted to look firstly at the structure of the vessels that the blood is actually flowing through to start with. So there are three main vessels that we are going to be looking at. The first one is arteries. We will then look at veins, and then the last one is capillaries. I quite like this diagram. It's very simple, it's very schematic, and obviously it's not this simple in real life. But we can look at the artery here. It's coloured red for a reason, which I'll come back to in a moment. The vein over here is coloured blue, and the capillary is kind of this purpley colour in the centre. And you can see these cross sections through the walls as well. So this part of the diagram here is basically showing you what the artery would look like if it had just been chopped across that way. So there's your cross section there, and the vein has been cut across here as well, and that is what it would look like in cross section, and the same thing goes for the capillary. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a couple of different features or ideas around each of these types of blood vessels. I'm going to talk about the wall thickness, the pressure of the blood that is associated with that particular blood vessel, and also the function of that blood vessel in particular. Okay, so let's start with the artery. The main thing that you notice about arteries, and you'll notice this when we do the heart dissection as well, is that they are very, very rubbery. So they've got a very sort of thick, rubbery feel to them. They are very resilient to pressure, and they're very elastic as well. So those are all words that you could use to describe them. And if we're to look at the wall thickness, you'll notice here that the wall is actually very, very thick in comparison to both the capillary and the vein there. So this red section, cross section here, actually represents muscle. In this case, it is smooth muscle that is surrounding the artery. And this smooth muscle is very clever because what it can do is it can contract. And when the smooth muscle contracts, it actually reduces the diameter of this blood vessel. And by changing the diameter of this particular vessel, it can actually alter the pressure that is generated in there as well. In a moment, I will write down some notes on this bottom part down here, but let's just talk about them first. I'm going to jump over to the vein next, and while this diagram looks like it's almost the same diameter as the artery, you can see in here there is just a very thin layer of the red in here, which represents the smooth muscle. And so the veins are not nearly as elastic. They have a much more floppy kind of feel to them. They don't hold their shape well if there is no blood inside them. And the smooth muscle, the much smaller ring of smooth muscle, means that they are not so easily able to control the diameter of them. Lastly, we look at the capillaries. The capillaries are very, very thin blood vessels. There's a very important reason that they have a very, very thin wall associated with them. And this means that a lot of the blood can diffuse directly through the wall of the capillary into the cells and the tissue that is surrounding it. So I've just put a couple of notes associated with those blood vessels now. So just saying that the artery is a very rubbery type of blood vessel, lots of smooth muscle associated with it. And over here we can see that let's move that around for you, that the vein is less smooth muscle and it doesn't have quite as rubbery a texture. Now if we had to compare the wall thickness of all three of those blood vessels, the artery would be a thick wall, the capillary would be very thin. In fact, sometimes it's only one cell thick, that's how thin it is. and the vein is probably considered to be a medium type of wall thickness. In terms of pressure that these blood vessels have to deal with, the highest pressure is found in the arteries, and that can be an enormously high pressure that the arteries, in particular arteries like the aorta, have to deal with. Huge amount of pressure. For now, I'm going to say that the capillaries are under a low pressure, although it is important to remember that there are some exceptions to this rule, such as in the kidneys. So the kidneys have a much higher type of pressure found within them. But generally speaking, the blood tends to flow quite slowly through capillaries. And veins that are returning blood back up to the heart, which we'll talk about in a second, is also under a very low pressure. Okay, so very quickly on to function now. I'll talk through this very briefly first, and then we'll look at this in a bit more detail when we go over to the blood flow through the heart, which is on the next slide. So generally speaking, the rule of thumb is that the arteries take blood away from the heart, veins return blood to the heart, and capillaries are found in basically all organs and tissues and anywhere that you need to get the exchange of gases and nutrients occurring. So capillaries tend to be found in muscle and in the lungs and in organs, and basically surrounded by cells in order to carry out an exchange process. Okay, so I've just written those ones in for you. Now, there is a reason that we are not saying that arteries contain oxygenated blood and veins contain deoxygenated blood, which is what this diagram up here is kind of suggesting. We'll talk about that over on the next page, but this is a much better way of learning it. Simply that arteries take blood away from the heart, and veins are going to return blood to the heart. So let's now look at the actual flow of blood through the heart and the order that the blood goes in through the heart, because it is slightly complicated. Now, because we are looking at this information in relation to mammals as a consumer, I'm going to cross out some of the names that are on this diagram because you don't need to know them. So these are going to be the valves. I'm just taking them out now. In fact, we'll cross them over like this. So if you were desperate to learn them, then go ahead and do that, but you do not need to know the names of the valves, okay? And to be perfectly honest with you, you probably don't need to know the names of some of these other veins and arteries as well, but you do need to know the basic flow of blood through the heart, basically the path that the blood takes. Okay, so I'm just going to do this with drawing it on as we go. And what I'm going to try and do is draw it as a blue line if that is representing blood that is deoxygenated. So in other words, it has given away all of its oxygen and it is now returning back up to the heart in order to get to the lungs and get more oxygen. Once the blood has more oxygen, I will draw that as a red arrow. Okay, so that's the plan anyway. Okay, so before we draw the blood coming through the heart, let's just look at the main features of the heart here, okay? So the main thing that we will recognise initially is that we have 4 chambers to the heart. So we have these 2 chambers down the bottom, which are the large ones. These are called the ventricles. We have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Now, one of the ways to remember or be able to recognise and label these diagrams is not by looking which side it is on, because the diagram that you get may be from a different perspective, so it may be flipped around. But instead, you look at the thickness of the wall. Okay, so the left ventricle wall is generally going to be about 3 times thicker compared to the right ventricle wall, and that is how you identify it. Generally, the chamber inside the left ventricle will also be much narrower, much smaller in comparison to the right ventricle there, okay? Up above them, we have the right atrium and the left atrium. These are always typically the same size as each other, so there's no real distinguishing features there. But the atria always sit on top and the ventricles are down towards the bottom, okay? Both of these atria and the ventricles have blood vessels that come into them and leave from them as well. So if we start off with the right atrium, we have 2 blood vessels returning into it. You can see the direction of the arrows there. So these are veins that are coming back into the heart, and we'll look at them in a little more detail shortly. And then out of the right ventricle, this is where we get this blood leaving, and that goes out through an artery. In this case, that's called the pulmonary artery. You can actually see there's one on each side. Okay, left side of the heart, we actually have, they've drawn it here as two from each side, but they actually branch very, very close to the heart. So sometimes you'll only see this as one as opposed to two. But these are veins that are returning from both sides of the lungs back into the left atrium. And then from the left ventricle, this is this massive big artery that comes out, and this is the aorta, and this kind of tends to loop around and come down. And often, rather than seeing three vessels coming up, you sometimes only see one coming up, and that tends to be the artery that goes off into basically the arms and the head. Okay, so let's quickly go through with the blood, and we'll just draw it. I'm going to try and draw it so that we leave the names of the structures there so that you can still see them. Okay, so let's start with blood returning to the heart. So in humans, we have two vena cava. We've got a superior and inferior, but in quadruped mammals like sheep, they actually have three vena cava, and they are not coming from the top and from the bottom. They're oriented quite differently. So do not get hung up on the position and the names of these. Just remember that these are veins that return to the heart. So I'm just going to draw them up now. So coming up into the atrium. That one there. Okay. So blood returns to the atrium from the body. That's where these vena cava, these veins are returning blood from the body to the right side of the heart. This blood then goes down into the right ventricle. The ventricle is a much more muscly chamber that is going to pump blood out of the heart. And in this case, we can see it leaves here. It's going to come out in that direction and also in this direction here. And that will be taking blood to the lungs. Okay, so maybe we'll write that up. To the lung, and this one here is returning from the body. Okay, so it goes to the lungs, it gets its oxygen, okay, and now it's going to return from the lungs back in to the left side of the heart. So I'm just drawing it into one of these pulmonary veins, but it will actually be returning through both of them. So we can write from the lungs down into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it travels down into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle is then going to create an enormously high pressure with its really, really thick wall, and it is going to pump blood out down through here, and this will go to the body. Sorry about it. It's getting slightly messy. That's okay. So that's the basic blood flow. Remembering that it's kind of like a figure eight. So it goes into the right atrium, right ventricle, out of the heart to the lungs, both sides, back from the lungs and through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, and then back out into the aorta where it goes back out to the body. The other thing that I want to very briefly look at is basically the path that a nutrient, for example glucose, might take as it passes through the circulation. And then we'll look at oxygen, because this all ties into respiration and where we're getting these raw ingredients for respiration from. So my little blue arrow is now going to represent nutrients like glucose. So in fact, we might look at this more in the next slide, but let's quickly just follow it through. So the nutrients return from the body into the right atrium, down into the right ventricle. The nutrients like glucose will travel all the way to the lungs. The nutrients will now be joined by oxygen from the lungs, and they will return through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, down into the left ventricle. It will then go up and out into the aorta, into the body, and then that's where it's actually going to be used up. So the nutrients like glucose have to travel all the way through the heart, to the lungs, back from the lungs, just to get back into the body tissues in order that they can use that glucose to carry out respiration. and very similar pathway with oxygen that you saw too. So let's go on to the next page, which has got a slightly more complex diagram, and we'll just see how mammals as a consumer ties into circulation. Okay, so very briefly, let's just finish running through this because the video is getting longer and longer as we speak. So you can just see here that you've got your heart in the centre that is linked into the circulation around the lungs. This is called the pulmonary circulation. So actually I might just write that up for you. Whoops. So that's the pulmonary circulation equals lungs. And the circulation that is basically the entire rest of the body is called the systemic circulation. And so that equals body. Okay, so down here is kind of representing, as well as representing the lower body, like the limbs and the legs and everything. It's also where the liver is, and so remembering that the liver is where glucose is stored and processed, and so the glucose from the liver and in fact from digestion from the stomach and connecting in with the ileum and the small intestines will link back up here, so the glucose will travel back up into the right side of the heart, down the right ventricle, out into the lungs. Glucose is now joined by oxygen back to the left side of the heart, the left atrium, down to the left ventricle, and then back out through the aorta that loops around. Some of it will come down here, and some of it will head back up to the head and the lungs as well there. And you can see all these little structures here. These are the capillary beds. So this is actually where we get this exchange of gases and this exchange of nutrients like glucose and like oxygen. And this is where this sort of process of respiration is going to start off. So we're not going to look at that in this video because it's getting a little bit long, but we will look at that in another one that we're going to look at on respiration.